Good afternoon, good evening, distinguished speakers, participants, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for joining the sessions on new advances in monitoring peatlands, standardizing what we measure where at the Peatland Pavilion's COP26. The session is hosted by the Scotland Rural College and the Center for International Forestry Research. I am Haruni Krishnawati, a principal researcher with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, Republic of Indonesia, and also the lead coordinator for the International Tropical Peatland Center, and will be chairing this session. Distinguished speakers, participants, ladies and gentlemen, the objective of the session will be to share standardized indicators that can be used to monitor outcomes of restoration in tropical and temperate peatlands. It is also to share the methods for standardizing data collection so that similar indicators can be developed for other peatland types, and of course, to discuss challenges around standardizing methods for data collection and reporting, and also options for developing and measuring social, economic, and governance indicators. We will have 1 hour 30 minutes in total for running the session. Joining us now, we have 4 prominent speakers that will share their knowledge and experience on monitoring peatland restorations. We would like to extend very well welcome to our distinguished speakers. First, we have Professor Mark Reed. He is the Professor of Rural Entrepreneurship and the Director for Thriving Natural Capital Challenge Center, Scotland Rural College. I hope Mark's already joining us now. And the second speaker, we will have Rupesh Bomia. He is the scientist from the Center for International Forestry Research. Rupesh also will be joining us online. And the next speaker, we will have Ibu Mirna Savitri, who will come directly to the Peatland Pavilion here in Glasgow. Ibu Mirna is the Deputy for Education and Training, Participation and Partnership, Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency. And the fourth, we will have Ibu Ana Sinaga. She is the consultant from CIFOR. They will also joining us online today. We would like to deliver their speech and our presentation in 15 minutes maximum. I hope all speakers could manage the time wisely. First, we would like to invite Professor Mark Reed to deliver your presentation. Professor Mark, time is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to join you here today. I'm going to be talking about how we can standardize biophysical measurements in peatland monitoring and research. If you were at the COP last year, you might have heard me talking about this, and I'll start with a similar background. But crucially, today I have results at last. And in fact, about 1 hour ago, we submitted our paper to Mars and Pete. So I'm looking forward to sharing these findings with you all for the first time today. Now, we all know that protecting, restoring, and sustainably managing our peatlands can play an important role in combating climate change, but the task of creating national peatland policy is far from simple. Benefits for the climate may come at the expense of benefits already enjoyed by local communities from their peatlands. And interventions that work in one location may have disastrous consequences when applied in a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, it's easy to criticize policymakers when things go wrong, but I think that we as researchers may also need to take some of the blame. The reason I say this is that researchers have a nasty habit of making policy recommendations from single studies. And I know I've been guilty of this myself. When my research funder has told me to write a policy brief at the end of my project, I've always done my best to come up with something useful that could be done in policy or practice on the basis of that single project. But what happens when another researcher comes along with contradictory findings and makes opposing recommendations to the very people I just briefed? Well, maybe one of us got the wrong answer, or perhaps we actually measured different things in different ways, or perhaps differences between our study sites might account for the apparent contradiction. Clearly, this is no way to do good policy. And of course, the civil servants among the audience will know that their task is to synthesize evidence from the patchwork of multiple studies and sites, rather than relying on single studies, no matter how persuasive the evidence of that one study might appear. But there's a problem. The majority of systematic reviews are not able to find enough high-quality evidence that can be synthesized because everyone's measuring different stuff. Even if two groups measure the same thing, say water table depth, they may measure it in very different ways, using different methods, which means we still can't synthesize the data. Even if they measure the same thing in the same way, the two groups may present their data in ways that still prevent synthesis, for example, omitting crucial contextual details like the location or the altitude at which the data was collected. So I don't know if I'm comparing like with like. As a result, there is a huge amount of research waste, where findings cannot be used beyond the sites in which they were originally collected. And of course, data that can't be used is the ultimate fieldwork fail. And if you want to laugh, then check out the fieldwork fail hashtag and book, which sadly features me running around a Ugandan forest semi-naked. Moving swiftly on, to address this challenge, I'm going to describe a major work stream from the Global Peatlands Initiative to standardize peatland data collection based on workshops. You can see some examples of these with peatland researchers from around the world, which took place over 3 years in the UK and Indonesia. Our goal is ambitious. We want to change the way peatland data is collected and reported so that more and more people collect data on the same variables in ways that can be synthesized. Ultimately, the goal is to facilitate meta-analysis that can enable more evidence-based policy and practice. Now, this was our approach, and so far we've followed the first 3 of these steps: identifying and prioritizing the most important outcomes people should measure in peatland research and monitoring. We trialed our approach in the UK, focusing on blanket and raised bogs, and then we replicated this for tropical peat swamps. And once we're all broadly measuring the same stuff, the next or final step is going to be to actually think about the methods we're using and how we report our data. But that's for future research. So to the results, and as you can see, the core outcomes were grouped in 4 broad areas: climatic, hydrological, biodiversity, and fire. And you can see the number of outcomes that were prioritized for UK raised and blanket bogs and for tropical peat swamps in each of these 4 areas. Now, fire-related outcomes were included in the UK. They were spread across all 4 of the outcome areas, but given the importance of fire as a driver of change in tropical peat swamps, we devoted an entire core area to fire in that habitat. So this is what it looks like in the paper that we submitted this morning, and you can see just the breadth of different outcomes for, in this case, just one of these core areas, climate change in one of the habitats, which is the tropical peat swamps in this case. So within this broad area, we've got 3 sets of outcomes. And I'm just going to give you this single one as an example. Don't worry, I'm not going to do the whole thing. You can read that once it comes out. So in this case, we've got outcomes relating to peat accumulation and loss, greenhouse gas fluxes, and above ground biomass. And as you can see, we've got a threshold dotted line here with only included outcomes that at least 70% of participants agreed were important to measure. And that's our consensus level. And we've color-coded them to show why we think they're important in terms of the sorts of evidence and policy questions you might be trying to answer. So in the top left graph, you can see that more than 70% of participants thought it was important to measure emissions from fire in projects that A, seek to inform social and economic policy, which is the green bar, B, that seek to promote sustainable management, protection and restoration, and then in orange, the climate mitigation policies. Whereas in contrast, bulk density and carbon content in peat are more important for projects that seek to inform climate policy. Although the lowland raised bogs and blanket bogs in the UK clearly differ very significantly to tropical peat swamps in terms of their ecology, their hydrology, drivers of change, and restoration practices, interestingly, both shared a number of core outcomes that participants agreed should be measured wherever possible. For example, in the broad area of climatic outcomes, I'll just dive into this one again to give you an example. Experts thought it was just as important in the UK as in the tropics to measure rates of peat accumulation. I can't say that word, accumulation, rates of changes in above ground biomass. And of course, in tropical peat swamps, this was all about trees, peat decomposition and oxidative loss, and greenhouse gas emissions and fluxes, and that included net carbon balance as well. And on the screen, you can see some of the other outcomes that were deemed important to measure in both habitats across all four of these broad areas. In addition to these core outcomes, a range of contextual variables were prioritized for measurement and reporting alongside these outcomes. Now, it was universally accepted that location data or maps and land use should be reported alongside all UK and tropical outcome sets. Without that kind of information, it's going to be difficult to assess the comparability of data from different studies. Having said this, the importance of other contextual information varied depending on the outcome sets being measured. For example, evidence of grazing and burning were deemed to be particularly important to report alongside climatic and ecological data, but less important to report alongside hydrological data, where things like drainage and rainfall data were deemed to be far more important in terms of contextual data. While our data suggests that it might be possible to create a core set of outcomes that should be measured across all peatlands globally, given the overlap between these two different outcome sets from this work, it's also clear that additional outcomes need to be prioritized for different peatland habitats based on their unique ecology and the drivers of change they're exposed to. We therefore think that the process we've tested and refined in this work could be replicated for other types of peatlands around the world, leading to a refined universal set of outcomes for global assessment, in addition to habitat-specific outcome sets for each peatland type. Funders of peatland research and monitoring might then request or require that data collection includes relevant core outcomes, in addition to any additional variables that you might need for a specific monitoring or research goal. Now, this doesn't mean outcomes that aren't in the core outcome sets won't ever be measured. If they're important for your particular study, then you should clearly prioritize them. But you will do so now in the knowledge that there may be few others measuring these, and as a result, there's less likelihood that your data may be used in future meta-analysis to inform wider policy and practice. To conclude, I think if we're serious about evidence-based policy and practice, the development of core outcomes we can all focus on measuring is of crucial importance. This initiative won't instantly enable us to harmonize data and create accurate global peat maps, or provide evidence synthesis to support the next decision you need to make. But we must stop and think about how we collect and report data now, if we want the data we collect to enable more evidence-based policy and practice in years to come. So here is the paper that we submitted, fully detailing this work this morning, and a huge thanks to our co-authors, who you can see on the screen here, a number of others who are acknowledged in the paper, who contributed to the writing in other ways, and much more besides. All of the workshop participants who were given the opportunity to contribute to the paper if they wanted to, and of course, without whom we would not have been able to do this work. If you want to find out more about this or discuss this with me, my email and Twitter handle are on the screen, and I look forward to discussing more with you in the rest of this session.
Thank you, Mark, for your insightful presentations. You share about the development of core common outcomes for peatland monitoring and research, and also to standardizing the biophysical measurement and peatland monitoring and research around the world. And next, I think I would like to invite the second speaker, Rupesh Bumia, who also joining us online. Rupesh will share us about the developing criteria and indicators for biophysical, social, economic, and governance outcomes of peatland restoration. Rupesh, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Haruni. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the audience members, people who are present in the Peatland Pavilion physically, as well as people who are joining from elsewhere. It is my pleasure to share some of the information, particularly after Mark Reed's great introduction to the idea of what we measure, how do we standardize those processes, and what they have done in UK and Indonesia. So I'll be taking you to a similar sort of journey, sharing our exercise that CIFOR conducted, and I'll share the approaches that we did to develop this standard method for effective monitoring of peatland restoration, and this particularly how principal criteria and indicators were derived. So for my presentation, I'll provide a brief background and then discuss a little bit about peatland restoration and monitoring and why it is important to monitor. Mark mentioned about the use of evidence for policy. That is a very good motivation, but it also for day-to-day management purposes that it can serve very important aspect what we monitor. And then different approaches for monitoring, how principal criteria and indicators could be one such approach, and then I'll share some of the summary and way forward. So I think in this room and the audience already know about the importance of peatland, that how they play an important role in addressing climate change. Peat layer in peatlands provide a unique permanent storage for carbon, if not disturbed. And this carbon is very important to keep in ground if we want to meet our targets to keep the temperature, global average temperatures below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius. On top of this service of carbon, peatlands provide other ecosystem services, that is habitat for biodiversity, and there are multiple co-benefits, which includes influencing regional hydrology depending on the season and peatland type, which regulate water flows in local bodies. And all of this by just covering a very small global land surface area. So peatlands store more than twice the amount of carbon than world's forest, but only cover about 3% of the global land surface. In spite or despite of all these important values and services peatlands provide, they are being drained and degraded, and this causes emission of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. These drained peatlands then become more susceptible to the fire, and causes a negative feedback. Peatlands drainage, therefore, is an immediate and most widespread global threat to integrity of these ecosystems, leading to the loss of other critical services. So I'm saying this to kind of cue the idea that when these peatlands, important ecosystems, are drained and degraded, then the obvious question comes, how do we revert back to their old status, old conditions? And that's where restoration comes into play. Peatland restoration involves measures that are designed to help ecosystems to revert to a state similar to or near to their natural state. This is possible by trying to re-establish some of their ecological processes and functions. This restoration is not an easy thing. Once these natural balances have been disturbed, it takes time and effort to put it back. And so it involves a complex process and needs to adopt an adaptive landscape approach that fits well with local conditions, needs, aspirations of dependent communities. Therefore, regular monitoring of restoration progress is important. This is all the background I shared to come to the point why monitoring is important, why monitoring peatland restoration is important. This is so that it can inform the design, strategy, selection of site-specific management approaches, and improve restoration efforts through adjustment. This is on top of the things that Mark mentioned about monitoring and standardizing practices of monitoring. Why do we do that? And to be able to monitor restoration, peatland restoration, testing monitoring protocols that are simple, easy to measure over time would be very helpful and particularly useful for the agencies and people who are involved in these peatland restoration projects. So there are various approaches for restoration monitoring. Some of the key parameters across the landscape needs to be measured in case of understanding overall holistic peatland restoration. This is a graphic from a manual that came out in 2020 by FAO. At the same time, there is another approach that involves principles, criteria, and indicators, which are easy to recognize, measure, and monitor over time and are flexible enough to include local context. And I'll be focusing on this principle, criteria, and indicators approach for peatland restoration monitoring today. So what are principles? Principle is a fundamental truth and will be elaborated in criteria. So it has this aspirational effect to it. That's how we would want an ecosystem to be like. And these principles have then have criteria underneath them, which are intermediate points to which information provided by indicators can be integrated and around which an interpretable assessment can be formed. So these criteria become this way to look at different aspects. And then indicators and verifiers fall below criteria. So if you look at the graphic on the right side, it have an hierarchical approach where a principle sits on the top, followed by criteria, and then each criteria had indicator and subsequent verifiers. So indicators are those variable components used to infer the status of a particular criteria, while verifiers contain data or information that enhances the specificity or the ease of assessment of an indicator. So indicator, as the word itself means, it indicates something, and then verifier allows us to test whether what is being indicated, how sure we can be on it. This is another way of looking at this principal criteria approach. So if our goal is to have effective and long-lasting peatland restoration, there are 4 aspects to it: biophysical, social, economic, and governance. You can think of them as 4 pillars of this peatland restoration. And each of these 4 aspects will have specific principle embedded in it. Each principle will have subsequent criteria, and each criteria will have indicators, and the indicators will have verifiers. So this needs to be applied at a location where peatland monitoring is to be undertaken. So you have to do this for all 4 aspects biophysics, social, economic, and governance, if the goal is to have effective and long-lasting peatland restoration. So how did we go about this? We organized a webinar series, we as in CIFOR, along with a lot of partners. And it included 4 webinars, which took place in 2020, last quarter of 2020. The first webinar, we focused on the biophysical and aspects. First webinar, we set the scene and we brought all the experts. And the second, we focused on the biophysical aspect. On the third, we focused on social economic governance aspects. And then the fourth one was synthesis. So here we identified all the potential criteria and indicators under each of these 4 pillars. And then in the synthesis workshop, this was an expert consultation involving more than 800 participants. So overall, these 4 webinars had 20 sessions, 50 speakers, and then 18 moderators facilitating 11 discussions, and altogether about 800 plus participants attended and participated and contributed to the discussions. That's how we derive our list of principal criteria indicators in all those 4 aspects. So I will not go in detail about all the criteria indicators because there is another presentation coming up later. But suffice is to say the 4 broad principles identified for all these 4 aspects included. For biophysical, we had wet and vegetated peatlands without any risk of damage and deforestation. For social aspect, our principle was community well-being and equity is widely demonstrated. For governance, the principle was fair and strong governance at all levels. And economic principle was a viable and sustainable peatland-based economy. During our discussion, we also touched upon some cross-cutting issues. One important aspect being role of women as decision makers, as someone who will play a key role in the success of these programs. So these are not captured here as a part of these principles, but under social and governance issues that comes in criteria and indicators, it becomes more clear. So after sharing this process, I just want to kind of wrap up by saying that in case of peatland restoration monitoring, principal criteria and indicators present a practical way to define, assess, monitor, and communicate the restoration efforts. This is important because due to their hierarchical manner and their sort of different suite of indicators, criteria, they allow us to be applied at various different locations, different sites, where one particular indicator may be relevant at one site, and on a different site, a different indicator may be relevant. But the process of measuring and monitoring and reporting those indicators remains the same. So there's the standard process involved, where by using this approach, multiple restoration projects can be monitored, and then the success could be reported to whoever is interested, whether stakeholders, whether managers. And then if the success is not great, then an intervention or a planned action could be taken to see the restoration is moving in the direction it is intended to. This PCI approach also is important because this is supposed to be applicable across different countries. Through social and governance criteria and indicators, it is aimed to be able to capture the local conditions that are prevailing and that are important for the success and failure of peatland restoration. For successful peatland restoration, a balanced approach towards restoration monitoring that covers all these 4 aspects will mean that restoration targets can be adequately quantified and success can be measured across the board. And then finally, adaptation of principal criteria and indicators by relevant agencies will help in adaptive management and decision-making processes towards peatland restoration. With that, I thank you, and I'll be open to have questions in the discussion session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rupesh, for your insightful presentations, and your message is clearly in terms of principal criteria and indicators for peatland restorations, and also the 4 aspects that need to be considered in peatland restoration, including biophysical, socio-economic, and governance outcomes. And of course, we already hear 2 presenters coming from the scientific community. And next, we would like to hear from the government perspectives. Ibu Mirna Savitri, she is the Deputy for Education and Training and partnership and participation from Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency. Ibu Mirna, we would like to hear from you about the role of governments for achieving peatland restorations, how to balance the needs between expectation and commitments. Ibu Mirna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Harumi. Good afternoon, distinguished speakers, participants, ladies and gentlemen. Glad to meet you here in person in Glasgow and also online today. And also thank you for inviting us in this panel. It's a very interesting panel actually, and I'm standing here not as a researcher, but as said by the moderator that I am representing a government agency to share with you about our plan, progress, and also approach in doing peatland restoration in Indonesia since 2016. So monitoring is very important, not only for researchers, but also for us as a government agency that's responsible again to do the peatland restoration. I'm also glad to inform you that I joined this panel today with my colleague, Professor Satyawan Pudyatmoko, who is the deputy one that is responsible for for planning and evaluation, where monitoring is also part of his task and our task in general. I will start my presentation to answer the questions of the organizer about the commitment of Indonesian government to peatland restoration. So may I just use this? Okay. So you can here see the new directives of peatland restoration. There are 3 things that need to be highlighted here. Number 1 is that the government of Indonesia has committed to make a permanent solution of forest and land fires prevention. And then one of the effort is to prevent peatland fires. And the second, peatland restoration that has been systematically implemented since 2016 is actually running well and need to be continued and accelerated. So the keyword here is to accelerate the peatland restoration, including the outcomes of the restoration. The target of peatland restoration from this year to 2024 is 1.2 million hectares, still implemented in 7 provinces, in Papua, Sumatra, and Kalimantan. And then the third one, it is now mandatory for us to make peatland restoration hand in hand with the improvement of community livelihood in the targeted areas of the restoration. And in December last year, our president enacted a decree to establish the Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency, or Badan Restorasi Gambut dan Mangrove, BRGM. So basically, you know that previously this agency, known as the Peatland Restoration Agency, having tasked to facilitate the facilitate the implementation of the peatland restoration from 2016 until 2020. And having seen that the task of doing restoration need more time, so that's why the government of Indonesia decided to continue the duty of the Peatland Restoration Agency, but adding some more tasks to also accelerate the mangrove rehabilitation. And now we became peatland and mangrove restoration agency. And both the peatland and mangrove restoration very clear from the duty that is obliged to us is to incorporate it with the community livelihood program. And we, as I mentioned before, that our new target now is 1.2 million hectares located in South Sumatra, in Riau, Jambi, in Central Kalimantan, West Kalimantan, South Kalimantan, and also Papua. If we look at from this slide, the map here, that's Riau still become our largest target area, then followed by Central Kalimantan, South Sumatra, and West Kalimantan. I also want to introduce you about our new structure. Now under the BRGM, we actually have 4 deputies. Deputy 1, Professor Satyawan, being the deputy responsible for making the planning, more detailed planning in this term will be conducted, and also to develop the monitoring system for the whole peatland restoration. And then the deputy 2 responsible still on the construction of the peatland rewetting and also for the revegetation. And then deputy 3, it's myself, responsible for any stakeholder engagement, community participation, education, socialization, etc. And then deputy 4 is for the community empowerment. Why the community empowerment being single the unit now? Because as I mentioned before, that the government really want to make a connection between the restoration and then the livelihood program. Okay, this is the map that I mentioned about the distribution of the target area of the peatland restoration in the next 4 years. And then this is the achievement of our first term until 2020. We built thousands of rewetting infrastructure, either canal blockings, canal backfillings, and also deep wells. We also work with the thousands of villagers that had been facilitated to initiate alternative livelihood, and also doing some demonstration plot of the revegetation. In terms of the socio-economic intervention, we have a program that we call the Desa Peduli Gambut, and in the previous years, and where 640 villages already facilitated under this program. And this program now being adopted into our midterm development program, being one of the priority of the national development until 2024. And the Desa Peduli Gambut, or the Pit Care Village program, was implemented previously in collaboration with many partners, CSOs, private sectors, local governments, and also with the international development agency support. One, if we look at from this slide, that we can see that 1.4 million hectares of targeted restoration overlap with the village territories. So many things happen, many lessons learned can be achieved from our intervention. And I just want to highlight again what the previous speaker said, that this is not easy to, to do peatland restoration in the situation like Indonesia, where so many people live and also depends on their livelihood from the peatland, where so many economic activities in whatever scale already exist, and then so many need of the development also exist. So that's why the challenge for doing peatland restoration is how to make a really balance of all needs in the development, not just to restore the environment, but also to improve the life of the people, and also to enhance the economic in general. And so if I can say again that the task of BRGM again is not only to facilitate the peatland restoration, but also to improve the community livelihood. And in this regard, we continue implementing our 3R approach, where we can find the peatland rewetting activities still continue, revegetation, and also livelihood approach. The fact that degraded peatland that need to be restored is situated in the villages, and learning again from our previous experience that working with the communities and village government really supported our achievement. So we continue implementing the Desa Peduli Gambut, or the village based, or we do the village based peatland restoration. And the idea of the Desa Peduli Gambut, or now become the Desa Mandiri Peduli Gambut, is basically to integrate the peatland restoration as much as possible to the village development. In this sense, the MPG serve the objectives. Now, one is to be a social preparedness to make the community ready to support the restoration. We do free and prior informed consent in this regard before we building the infrastructure of rewetting. Number two is to strengthen local and village institutional process to support the peatland restoration. And then the last one, we also want to use the MPG is in our exit strategy to make our community-based peatland restoration become sustained. The other issue that I would like to highlight here is about the collaboration and partnership. We realize that doing peatland restoration needs effective collaboration. Working mostly with the communities is necessary, but we also need to understand that there are also any other stakeholders that also need to be in one framework in support the peatland restoration. So we are trying to make the peatland restoration become more inclusive, involving also women and also youth. And to conclude, our experiences teach that doing peatland restoration must be inclusive, open to any collaboration, and successful to make the real impact of such a collaboration by working together in the same landscape. The period of 2016 to 2020 is just an initial phase of doing systematic peatland restoration. Many achievements obtained, but many homeworks need to be completed. Consolidating data, information, best practice experience, and develop a very easy to do monitoring system becomes also our priority. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibu Mirna, for your insightful presentations. I think that's clear message from the governments, from Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency. What's the progress in the peatland restoration in Indonesia, and what the challenge? And the clear message is restoration is not just to restore the degraded peatlands, but the most important thing also to improve the livelihood community. So the peatland restoration need to be connected with the livelihood community, and also the program need to be integrated with rural development policy. I think that's the message. Next, we have the last but not the least speaker, Ibu Ana Christina Sinaga. she is the consultant from Center for International Forestry Research, is also working on the development of criteria and indicator for peatland restorations. Ibu Ana, we would like you to share about verifying and testing criteria indicator for peatland restorations. Ibu Ana, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Ibu Haroni, for the chance to talk about the verifying and testing process. Good afternoon and good evening from Jakarta, distinguished speakers and ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to talk about verifying and testing criteria and indicators developed by CIFOR for monitoring progress on tropical peatland restoration, particularly in Indonesia. I will start with some background first and then context of the development of these criteria and indicators. Although Pak Rupesh already mentioned and touched upon that this part in his slides. And I also will describe a little bit about the process in developing the manual for these criteria and indicators. A little bit also the process on and the progress of identifying the verifiers, as Pak Rupesh mentioned, to find information to test the criteria and indicators, and what we have learned so far from this process. And on this last slide, some information on plan for the next step. So Pak Rupesh has mentioned this. There's a need to monitor progress on conducting restoration. This is important to allow for an adaptive approach to ensure the outcomes of restoration being achieved. A reliable and practical set of criteria and indicators could help assessing the progress and evaluate the efforts in the peatland restoration. And also, I just want to reiterate how monitoring and evaluation practices are very beneficial to inform design, strategy, and site selection, and on peatland restoration. Another important event is also that Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency is now developing a model peatland hydrological unit, which would inform future restoration works. So we see this as an opportunity to contribute to the process. Based on that context, with the support of MOEF and BRG at that time, last year, CIFOR organized a series of online workshops inviting a diverse group of stakeholders, as Pak Rupesh mentioned in his presentation, to explore criteria and indicators for tropical peatland restoration. And following those workshops, now we are developing verifiers to test to be the tool to give information for these indicators. Later on, we will conduct field tests to improve and revise the criteria and indicators. Pak Rupesh already mentioned as well. There are 4 aspects that were identified from the biophysical, economic, social, and governance. I think this is very interesting because now restoration is not only about the biophysics, but also we're talking about the social and the governance aspect, and also the economics. BRG has shown how important it is to have, for example, revitalization projects to help the communities to be able to comply with restoration requirements. So here we have criteria such as restored hydrology, ecosystem, or land cover under the biophysical aspect, and some indicators for that criteria are water table and dryness index, dominant land use, commercial species. While from the economic aspects, criteria include sustainable value chain and economic incentives, where the indicators show will be promotion of local products, access to finance, access to markets, and etc. In total, there are about 14 criteria and 58 indicators, which the team and the team would analyze to identify the verifiers to give information for the indicators. What we have trying so far is that we try to find these indicators that are applicable, that will be correlated to indicators that have been developed previously. These verifiers at the moment are being developed based on Indonesian context. For example, in the biophysical criteria, we see types of water table intervention and affecting rewetting area as verifiers for the indicators on the water table indicators. We hope that that these verifiers can provide tools to monitor the progress and impact of the intervention that have been done and how it contribute to the indicators on water table or even dryness index or soil moisture. The same with for the economic aspect. For example, we are looking at promotion strategies by local governments as verifiers to see how the promotion of local products in certain province where restoration projects are being conducted. And this will need data from the local government and also the local community businesses. So we can see that this one indicator will require a number of verifiers and data from different actors as well. We also have quite broad indicators such as power sharing or rule of law, and we also try to define the verifiers for this because it has so many elements. And this is also what some findings that we have during implementing the process. We're hoping that we will find the data on the field using these verifiers. So what we have learned so far, as I previously mentioned, and perhaps as it is shown, that translating these indicators to practical verifiers is quite challenging. Some of the indicators are quite broad and it contains many elements, and so there should be room for adjustments for the criteria and indicators, just to make sure that it can be used on the ground, on the restoration practices. Immediately, we also learn the gaps between scientific indicators and restoration practices. For example, every restoration projects may have different baseline data or parameters on assessing the progress, and some verifiers identified or indicators identified may not be applicable to all restoration projects. So this is something that we need to figure out in the process. Again, testing one verifier may require data from different actors, so it will require a massive work and data collection. That's why prioritizing indicators is very important, because when an indicator needs complex verifiers in data, and when budget and time are limited, there should be we should choose which one we want to focus on to make sure that we can monitor progress. Again, some data may not be available. This is also what we found during our discussion with BRGM. And so recommendations for the government and also restoration projects to develop the baseline before conducting the projects is very important to ensure the monitoring process. And government support and commitment are key, I think, in conducting this exercise, because the government has and I think holds a lot of authority on data, so it is important to gain their support and also to connect the criteria and indicators in the scientific environment to what is happening on the ground. So it is very important to gain their support. This is the summary of the process that we are conducting. So after we identify all the verifiers through expert consultations, literature survey, meetings, and etc., we will test it on PHUs, peatland hydrological units. And at the moment, we aim to have this verifiers tested at 2 PHUs just to make sure that we have comparative data on this. So what's next? We are still trying to continue the consultation meetings with BRGM and restoration projects. This includes how we will define the criteria for PHU where we do or we conduct the testing exercise. The field testing itself is planned to be done this month and December. And following that field testing, we will draft the manual and we will have a workshop to discuss and disseminate our exercise in February 2022. Yes, again, thank you for this opportunity to share with you. I hope our experience so far is useful for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Ibu Anna, for your insightful presentation, and you have shared with us about the experience in drafting the manual for monitoring peatland restorations and what aspects, criteria, indicators, and what the verifiers need to be used for monitoring peatland restorations. Distinguished speakers, participants, ladies and gentlemen, I think we already have all speakers sharing with us, and thank you very much for all speakers for sharing in these sessions. We are now in the discussion sessions. Let's see if we already have some list of questions from the audience and the participants here. I think we have list of comments and questions to Rupes, Prof. Makris, Ibu Mirna. I think for Ibu Anna, the question and comments will coming soon. I think I would like to invite Margaret. Would you like to facilitate the question and answer, or I can read?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We have the question to Mr. Rupes, and yes. Okay. Maybe I don't know if Mark, you have access to the questions on the chat. Okay. Okay. We'll give the opportunity to you, Mark, to facilitate the and respond. Maybe you can respond the questions directly if this addressed to you, and also Rupes and Ibu Mirna. And Ibu Mirna, I can read the question for you, and Ibu Anna, you can read the questions coming to you. Mark, I give the opportunity to you.
So the first question is for Rupesh. And the question is, do you think there should be a differentiation of the principal criteria and indicator for used stroke managed, so that's estate, crops, agriculture, etc., and non-used or unproductive areas of peatland, given the different issues and the complexities faced? So should we have different types of principal criteria and indicators for these different types of peatlands? Rupesh.
Thank you, Mark. This is an interesting question. I'll try to kind of do a little explanation rather than being brief so that it is understood well. So again, it has to start from what is the goal. The idea is to restore that peatland, depending on the situation that is, whether it's a productive system from a state cropping area or it's an unproductive, unused area. But the idea, if the goal is to have a functioning, structurally integral peatland, which can have all the previous structure and functions, all the ecological processes, all the ecosystem services that a healthy, intact peatland provides. If that is the goal for restoration, then that is embedded in the principles. Depending on what principles apply there. If we are talking an area of a peatland which is already doesn't far away from a community or far away from any boundaries, which doesn't face any disturbance because of any economic pressures or any governance issues or any social pressures, then those principles, criteria, indicators will, of course, would not have much effect or much importance in that case. But assuming that both areas, being a state or a unproductive area, both are in the same vicinity, same part of landscape, then having a similar set of principal criteria indicators will be useful because the end goal is same. So having said so, the principal criteria and indicators approach are flexible enough to be applied and in different settings. So this is one case where the question was asked for two settings, but it could be that a peatland is in a, say, in the same country. If we take example of Indonesia, if it's in two different islands, so there may be different provincial things, there may be different type of communities, there may be different dependent people, different ways of harvesting things that are coming from that area. And if we want to address that, then we have to take into account those particular criteria and indicators which are relevant to that setting. And by doing repeated measurements, like once a restoration project is started, once interventions have been put in place, then you do this PCI approach. You kind of have this manual where you go and test all of these criteria and indicators and have a measurement. And then over time, you can see whether you have making good progress on certain indicators. That means you are achieving or moving towards restoration. And that means the intervention is successful. If you are not, the indicators are not indicating progress, that means there is something missing. And you can see which indicators are pointing to the lack of progress. And that's where the emphasis needs to be given. So that's how I'm trying to convey to you that this PCI approach, by having all these four principles covering all four aspects, allows you to see what is important in that contextual setting and then apply that or tailor-made that those restoration intervention that you would want to apply in that particular location. Okay, thank you, Mark. It was a little bit long answer, but I hope it clarifies.
It's very comprehensive, so I appreciate. So a follow-up question for you, Rupesh, and Anna, I wonder if you might want to add to this. So being more critical, ideally we want to use these four elements, the principal criteria, indicators, etc., to make actual action on the ground. And so someone's asking, what is the limiting factor that decides on success or failure? What is the greatest challenge to actually operationalizing this in practice?
Mark, let me start and then Anna can chip in. But I think in one of the last or second last slides of, that Anna shared about some of the challenges, kind of captures that aspect. So when we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of applying or operationalize the principle and criteria indicators approach, that's where you need to come up with these verifiers, the data that needs to be collected on ground. So it is easy for biophysical aspect that this data is sort of quantifiable. You can go and measure through different means what is the water table depth is. But when you talk about the social and governance aspect, some of these criteria or indicators are very difficult to measure, because that's where subjective or personal opinion comes into play. And it all depends on who is conducting this exercise, who is measuring, who is reporting that data. So there needs to be some sort of uniformization or some sort of training where these things can be captured. Sometimes there is a very diverse community depending on these peatlands, and they have different perspectives, different way these resources are valued, and it is very often very hard to capture that. So that's where the biggest challenge is. And I think successful operationalization would eventually mean that we come up with these metrics which are easy to sort of comprehend, easy to understand and apply. So if someone is using this manual or using this approach in, say, in Africa, then they are not interpreting it completely differently than someone who is doing in Indonesia. So this becomes one of the biggest challenges. How do you tone down this complexity and make it user-friendly, make it straightforward and simple?
Very good, thank you. Anna, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I think it's exactly what Pak Rupas has mentioned, because when we try to translate these indicators to the verifiers, one thing that really hamper us if the indicators are very strict. I mean, if there's no room for adjustment or contextualization, so it will be very difficult to measure. So flexibility is very important, and understanding the local context, because I think someone in the workshops that CIFOR held said that perceptions can be very different from one actor to another. So we have to understand their perspective as well, to make sure that we have the right criteria, the right indicators to monitor progress. So yeah, and again, what is the limited factor? I think this is the inflexibility that will harm the product.
Yeah, context really matters, and how that gets applied can really make a difference. So good, I'm going to invite Mirna back to the stage now, if that's okay, and ask a few questions to Mirna, and then I'll conclude by answering the questions that were addressed to me. Haruni, would you like me to read these questions to Mirna, or would you like to do that?
Okay. Mark, I can read the question for Ibu Mirna. Ibu Mirna, maybe more convenient for you if you come forward and sit in the front. Okay. Mark, would you like to read the question for Ibu Mirna, or I will be okay? Mark.
Right, so I'll start with two related questions. So someone is asking if you can tell us a bit more about the progression of peatland restoration in the pilot village you talked to us about in Indonesia. And related to this, someone else is asking, what can we learn from indigenous people's knowledge about peatland management, and how can we incorporate that knowledge in policy? The challenge this person is saying is that much of the knowledge has perhaps been forgotten. So they had read that the Dayak people would not cultivate peatlands with more than 50 centimeters of depth in the inland peatland, and the Banjar people only dig small, short-length canals for rice cultivation on coastal peatlands. So a bit more detail about the pilot village, and so your broader views on how we can incorporate indigenous knowledge, bearing in mind that many of the important lessons we might have been able to learn may have been forgotten.
Okay, thank you, Mark. It's a very interesting questions. First of all, I would like to say that we recognize the indigenous knowledge. We understand that in the past, that the sustainable of peatland management can be achieved by the indigenous peoples when they use their knowledge. However, we see here the current situation that the peatland already degraded. So the ecological system is different. And also, if we look at about the composition of the community in the peatland ecosystem, it's also now very diverse. There are so many migrations happened in the past, not only because of the government-sponsored projects, but also some of them coming before the independence. So this is the legacy of also from the colonial government. So the social issues is very complex in the peatland landscape. So that's why what we are doing is to depend on the existing situation, and then also understand that the past experience is very good, but the challenge is how to make the new adaptive knowledge to respond to this current situation. So that's why, if I can give you an example, we develop what we call as a farmer field school, peat farmer field school, to introduce about the zero burning technology. It's a little bit an issue because in one side, some groups say that, okay, we need to recognize the indigenous practices where they're using the burning technology. Okay, that's good. That's right. However, when we talk about the current situation, when the peatland is relatively different, the condition, so we cannot, we cannot, we cannot continue to say that the burning is something safe for now. So that's why the exchange knowledge between the indigenous and also the migrant is being the essence of our field school. And also we develop together with the indigenous, with the migrants, with the academia to develop a new technology of utilizing the peatland without making the situation getting worse, without implementing again the burning of the peatland, and also to respond to the local needs of the agriculture practices. That's, I think, what I can respond.
Yeah, really impressive just to see the range of things that you're doing and the depth with which you're engaging with those different knowledges from very different groups within Indonesia. I'm going to ask you a second and final question, which is based on someone who, in their experience, is saying that many of the canal blocks only seem to last for around 2 or 3 years. And so the question is, how does BRGM monitor that the peatland restoration infrastructures like canal blocking have achieved their purposes and continue to work in the long term?
Yes, we actually develop the monitoring of the canal blockings infrastructure. First, we have a platform to see about the existing condition of the canal block that's already built, and we use that kind of data to to develop another program of the maintaining of the canal blocks. And then we also develop a platform to see about the broader condition of the peatland. That's called the PRIMS. PRIMS is a platform that can be publicly accessible, where we can see about what is actually the progress day by day, time by time, about the impact of the canal blocks to the what is the water table and also the humidity of the peatland. We support by several organizations nationally and also internationally to develop that kind of platform. If I may invite my colleague to respond, is it possible? For Professor Satyawan, because he's the one who is responsible for the monitoring of the peatland.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much, Ibu Mirna. Yes, as mentioned previously by Ibu Mirna, we develop a platform for planning, for restoration action, and also for maintenance. So with this platform, we can identify which canal blocking is still functioning and which is not functioning anymore, and which need more maintenance, and where we should build a new canal blocking. So then every year we record all activity on peatland restoration, and we determine the activity based on the situation or the condition of canal blocking and other infrastructure, like when we monitor the groundwater level. Thank you.
So before you sit back down, Professor, I wonder if you can answer the question about how long these dams are lasting. So this person has said from their experience, I don't know whether that's a broad experience or just one local dam, but that they are sometimes quite short-lived. Have you noticed problems like that?
Apa dia pertanyaannya? Not very clear.
Yeah, so the questioner said that in their experience, the peat dams were only lasting for 2 or 3 years.
Okay, yeah.
Is that your experience as well?
No, it is depend on the material of the canal blocking. Yeah, in some place we use wood, and in some place we use beton, for example. So this very different material quality. For wood, I think 5 years, 4 years we should renew this canal blocking. But for beton and other material, we can use it for longer time. But we still, until now, still looking for the technology that is cheap and long-lasting and adaptive to the local condition. Is still a question also for us to looking for the best material for canal blocking. Thank you.
Right, and the fantastic thing to hear is that even if there are some problems, there is a very rigorous monitoring scheme in place. So you will spot if there are problems and then can fix those dams if they have failed. So a very rigorous approach. Thank you for a comprehensive answer, both of you. I'm going to conclude by answering some questions directed to me, and I will then hand back to Professor Haruni to ask any final questions and wrap up the session. So there are 4 questions which all link to each other. The first asking, what is the biggest challenge when it comes to standardizing what data we collect, how we're collecting that, and how we're reporting it? And so there are these 3 areas that I choose from here. And I will confess that I think we may have chosen one of the easier aspects to solve first, which is what are we measuring? And the process that we have run has gained consensus from the peatland community who have engaged with us around what are the core things we should be measuring. I think also relatively straightforward is sorting out how we report this. So there are a number of initiatives, Peat Data Hub being one of them, but there are other examples for other areas that we can learn from where this has been done successfully before. The biggest challenge, I believe, is going to be around methods, because there's a range of opinion about how effective different methods are, and a range of different criteria you can use to judge the effectiveness of different methods. And I think that whilst there may be certain methods that we might warn people against, in general, it is likely that we would need to provide a quite detailed evaluation of the strengths and limitations of methods for different contexts and for different purposes. And we need to bear in mind that that will need to include the purpose of both researchers who need very accurate methods, but they can afford very expensive technical equipment, at the same time as providing methods that can be used in monitoring initiatives that may have a lower budget, or even citizen science, and evaluating whether there are methods that could be used, perhaps proxies, for example, that are reliable enough, but that could be used in these kinds of contexts and for these kinds of purposes. So I think the methods is the biggest challenge. Someone else asked how long will it take to do that? And I think it depends on how much of this challenge we decide to bite off. And so my recommendation would be, we've done this. I focused in this presentation on the climatic core area. My suggestion would be, let's start with one area, say climatic variables, one habitat, say tropical peat swamps, and then have a look at the range of methods that exist there. And that could be tractable within a project over the course of, say, a year. But you get a sense of then how much you need to add on to that if you want to do all of the core areas for more than one habitat. Of course, there will be a lot of overlap methods that can be used in different habitats. The third of the four questions is, well, how do we roll this out then? We've done it for tropical peat swamps, for raised and blanket bogs in the UK. What if we want to take this to tundra, for example, tundra peatlands? Well, the answer is quite simple. We've got a methodology, and for getting consensus on what the core outcomes are, we've now validated that through replication, and whilst you might need to adapt it to an extent, so for example, the kinds of policy criteria that you might use to help people decide which of these are most important, we do have that method in place. Although, as I've said, we need to develop a process for evaluating the methods used to generate the data for those core outcomes. So a relatively straightforward process to roll this out if we want to other peatlands. And the final question is, well, should we make this mandatory for all restoration projects? I'm going to give you a controversial answer, which is yes. And when I say yes, that does not mean that all restoration projects have to measure exactly the same stuff. We won't have the money to be able to do that everywhere. But when you, as a restoration manager, have the challenge of, you've been told to collect restoration data, where do you start? And my message would be, you should start with these core lists and select from them. Maybe you've only got time and money to measure 5 outcomes, fine, but choose them from this list, and then you significantly increase the chances that your data can then be combined with other people's data and actually provide lessons at a scale far beyond the monitoring sites that you are in charge of. Haruni, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mark, for your very good facilitation on the question and answer, or also how you respond the question that has been addressed to you. And also thanks for Ibu Mirna and Prof. Satyawan for responding the questions, and of course for Rupes and Ibu Anna who has responded to the questions. And I think we have been learning a lot from all speakers who has been sharing their knowledge and experience on setting up the criteria, indicators, and verifier for peat monitoring peatland restorations. I think we have some key messages that we have been learning so far in terms of criteria and indicators for peatland restoration monitoring that has been created, and to establish the core outcomes, what should be measured where possible for effective peatland monitoring and research. And by standardizing what is measured across projects and across countries for different types of peatland in the world, it will be possible to synthesize the findings to develop more evidence-based policies and practice to give the recommendation for and inputs for policy makers. And also this could be to provide the guidance of what is the most important variables to measure if evidence is to be used at whether is it at the national, regional, or the global synthesize. And it will also be possible to consider the indicators to track the progress on the effect of restorations, whether this is on biophysical, economics, social, and governance aspects. Distinguished speakers, participants, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are now have reached the end of the sessions on new advance in monitoring peatlands, standardizing what we measure where. Thanks again for all the speakers for having delivered the very good presentation, sharing with us new knowledge on core common outcomes and also criteria and indicators for monitoring peatland restorations. And of course, to the participants and all the audience who joining us here for the session. And thanks again for keeping stay until the end of the sessions. Thank you very much for your attention.